You think you know Formula One? Think again. The 2010 seconds delivered some of the most mind-bending, jaw-dropping moments in motorsport history that sound like they came straight out of a fever dream. From drivers literally getting out of their cars mid-race, to teams spending more on a single car part than most people make in a lifetime, the decade was absolutely bonkers. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never look at F1 the same way again. Let me start with something that'll blow your mind. In 2012, Sebastian Vettel won the championship by just 3 points. 3. That's the margin between legends and footnotes in F1. But here's the kicker. He was running in 6th place, with just 7 laps to go in the final race. The championship was slipping away faster than a Formula One car on fresh tires. Then, chaos erupted. Cars started crashing, spinning out, and suddenly Vettel found himself charging through the field like a man possessed. When the checkered flag waved, he'd somehow clawed his way to 6th place, just enough to snatch the title. But that's just the warm-up act. The 2010 seconds were absolutely riddled with moments that defied logic, physics, and sometimes basic common sense. You ready for this rabbit hole? Because we're going deep. Picture this scenario. You're watching a Formula One race. Cars are screaming around the track at 200 miles per hour. And suddenly, a driver just stops, gets out of his car, mid-race, while other cars are still racing. This actually happened, and not just once. The most famous instance involved Heikki Kovalainen in 2010, whose car literally caught fire. Instead of waiting for marshals, he jumped out and started pushing his burning car off the track himself. The images were surreal. A driver in full racing gear manually moving a Formula One car while smoke billowed around him. The announcers didn't know what to say. The fans didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It was peak F1 absurdity. Speaking of fire, let's talk about something even more bizarre. The fact that F1 cars in the 2010 seconds were essentially rolling computers worth more than luxury mansions. Each car contained over 300 sensors, generating approximately 100 gigabytes of data per race weekend. To put that in perspective, that's enough data to store about 25,000 songs or 50 full-length movies. Teams had armies of engineers analyzing every microsecond of telemetry, tracking tire temperatures, brake pressures, gear ratios, and even the driver's heart rate. They knew more about what was happening inside those cars than most people know about their own bodies. But here's where it gets really weird. All that technology, all those millions of dollars in research and development, and sometimes the difference between winning and losing, came down to the most random, unpredictable factors imaginable. In 2011, a seagull, yes, a seagull, nearly changed the outcome of the Canadian Grand Prix. The bird flew directly into Lewis Hamilton's car during practice, damaging the front wing and forcing the team to rebuild the entire aerodynamic package. Hamilton ended up winning that race in one of the most dramatic comebacks in F1 history. But imagine if that seagull had struck 1 lap later, or if the damage had been more severe. A random bird could have altered championship standings. The relationship between drivers and their cars in the 2010 seconds reached levels of intimacy that bordered on the supernatural. Drivers could feel changes in tire pressure within fractions of a PSI. They could detect aerodynamic imbalances that would be invisible to casual observers. Sebastian Vettel famously named his cars. His 2013 championship-winning Red Bull was called Hungry Heidi. Other drivers developed their own rituals and superstitions. Some would only enter their cars from the left side. Others had specific sequences for putting on their gloves and helmet. These weren't just quirks. They were psychological anchors in a sport where mental state could mean the difference between podium finishes and catastrophic crashes. The physical demands on drivers during this era were absolutely insane. During a typical race, drivers would lose between 6 to 8 pounds of body weight through sweat alone. The cockpit temperatures regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. G-forces during cornering could reach 5 Gs, meaning drivers experienced 5 times their body weight pressing against them. To put that in perspective, astronauts experience about 3 Gs during rocket launches. F1 drivers were essentially enduring spaceflight-level physical stress for 2 straight hours while making split-second decisions. at speeds that would terrify most people. The tire situation in the 2010 seconds was its own special kind of madness. Pirelli, the tire supplier, was specifically asked to create tires that would degrade quickly to make racing more exciting. Think about that for a moment. They intentionally made worse tires to improve the show. Teams had to manage tire strategies like chess masters, calculating exactly when to pit, which compound to use, and how aggressively drivers could push without destroying their rubber. Some races turned into elaborate guessing games, where teams with superior cars lost to teams with better tire management. It was like watching the world's most expensive and dangerous game of rock, paper, scissors. The weather added another layer of complete unpredictability. The 2011 Canadian Grand Prix lasted over 4 hours due to rain delays and red flags. 4 hours, that's longer than most movies. Drivers sat in their cars during red flag periods, engines off, just waiting. Some got out and chatted with competitors, others meditated or tried to stay in their racing mindset. The mental challenge of maintaining focus and intensity during these extended periods was enormous. When racing finally resumed, track conditions changed by the minute. Parts of the circuit would be bone dry, while other sections remained treacherous. Drivers were essentially racing on multiple different tracks simultaneously. Here's something that sounds like science fiction but was absolutely real. F1 teams in the 2010 seconds used predictive algorithms that could forecast optimal pit strategies based on weather patterns, competitor behavior, and historical data. These systems were so sophisticated that they could calculate the probability of safety car deployments, estimate fuel consumption rates down to individual milliliters, and predict tire degradation curves with remarkable accuracy. Yet despite all this technological wizardry, races were still won and lost by human intuition, driver skill, and pure luck. The economic numbers from this era are mind-boggling. Top teams were spending upwards of $400 million per season. That's more than the GDP of some small nations. A single front wing could cost $150,000, and teams would bring multiple versions to each race weekend. The steering wheels alone cost approximately $60,000 each and contained more computing power than the computers that sent humans to the moon. Drivers weren't just athletes, they were test pilots for the most advanced automotive technology on Earth. The rivalry between teammates often created more drama than competition between different teams. Lewis Hamilton and Jenson Button at McLaren, Fernando Alonso and Felipe Massa at Ferrari, Sebastian Vettel and Mark Webber at Red Bull. These partnerships were masterclasses in psychological warfare. Teams tried to maintain neutrality while secretly favoring one driver over another. Data was sometimes withheld. Setup information was carefully managed. The politics inside each garage were more complex than international diplomacy. Safety innovations during the 2010 seconds were revolutionary, but came from tragic necessity. The introduction of the Halo device in 2018 was initially controversial. Many people thought it looked ugly and disrupted the traditional F1 aesthetic. But this device has since saved multiple lives, deflecting debris and protecting drivers during crashes that would have been fatal in previous eras. The irony is that fans complained about a safety feature that made the sport less dangerous, when danger had always been part of F1's appeal. It was a perfect example of the sport's constant tension between spectacle and safety. Radio communications between drivers and their teams provided incredible insights into the mental state of competitors under extreme pressure. Drivers would scream in frustration, celebrate victories before crossing the finish line, or provide technical feedback while navigating turns at 180 miles per hour. These conversations revealed the human drama behind the helmets and racing suits. Sometimes drivers would argue with their engineers about strategy. Other times they'd crack jokes or make observations about competitors. The radio was like a direct line into the consciousness of people operating at the absolute limit of human performance. The 2010 seconds also featured some of the most bizarre technical regulations in F1 history. Teams had to use 2 different tire compounds during each race. Fuel flow was limited to exactly 100 kilograms per hour. Cars could use a maximum of 100 kilograms of fuel for the entire race distance. These restrictions led to incredibly complex strategies where drivers had to balance speed with fuel conservation creating a chess match within the racing spectacle. Some drivers became masters of fuel-saving techniques that allowed them to push harder at crucial moments while maintaining overall efficiency. Qualifying formats changed multiple times throughout the decade, creating confusion for fans, teams, and sometimes even the drivers themselves. The knockout qualifying system meant that the slowest cars were eliminated in phases, building tension as lap times determined who would advance to the next session. But the formats were so complex that casual viewers needed flowcharts to understand what was happening. It was like watching a sport where the rules were constantly being rewritten mid-competition. Weather radar became a crucial strategic tool. Teams employed meteorologists who could predict rain patterns with incredible precision, sometimes giving advance warning of weather changes that would affect only specific sections of the track. This information was so valuable that teams guarded their weather data like military secrets. A 5-minute advantage in knowing about incoming rain could determine race outcomes. The physical preparation required for F1 drivers reached new levels of sophistication. Training regimens included exercises specifically designed to strengthen neck muscles for G-force resistance, hand-eye coordination drills that would challenge professional video game players, and cardiovascular conditioning that rivaled Olympic endurance athletes. Some drivers trained with fighter pilots to improve their spatial awareness and reaction times under stress. The decade concluded with fundamental changes that would reshape Formula One's future. Hybrid power units replaced traditional engines, creating a new technical challenge that combined raw power with energy management. The sport began embracing social media and digital content, making drivers more accessible to fans than ever before. New circuits were added to the calendar, expanding F1's global reach, while sometimes sacrificing traditional racing venues with decades of history. Looking back at the 2010 seconds, Formula One was a sport caught between tradition and innovation, where cutting-edge technology coexisted with human drama, where million-dollar machines could be undone by bird strikes or raindrops. It was a decade of contradictions, where the pursuit of perfection led to beautiful chaos, where the most sophisticated racing cars in history still depended on the unpredictable genius of human drivers pushing themselves beyond normal limits. The bizarre facts from this era remind us why Formula One captivates millions of fans worldwide. It's not just about the fastest car or the most skilled driver, but about the intersection of human ambition, technological innovation, and pure unpredictable chance that creates moments of sporting magic that can't be replicated anywhere else on Earth. What if I told you that Formula One drivers in the 2000s were literally getting high during races and it was completely legal? Or that one team accidentally created a car so fast they had to intentionally make it slower? The 2000s were absolutely wild for Formula One, and today I'm going to blow your mind with some of the most bizarre, unbelievable facts from this golden era that even die-hard fans probably don't know. We're talking about exploding wheels, drivers who couldn't fit in their own cars, and a championship that was decided by a single point after the most dramatic season finale in F1 history. Plus, I'll reveal why Michael Schumacher once had to drive with a broken leg, how a team owner ended up in prison, and the insane story of how Toyota spent over $1 billion and never won a single race. But first, let's start with something that sounds like science fiction, but was happening every single weekend. During the 2000s, F1 cars were equipped with traction control systems so advanced that they were essentially driving themselves in certain situations. The cars could make thousands of micro adjustments per second, cutting power to individual wheels faster than any human could react. Drivers described it as feeling like the car was alive, anticipating their every move. But here's where it gets really weird. The traction control systems became so sophisticated that they started creating an unintended side effect. The rapid cutting of engine power created a distinctive sound that fans began to recognize. Some cars would make a machine gun-like rattling noise during acceleration, while others produced an almost musical tone. Engineers realized they could actually tune these systems to create specific sounds, turning F1 cars into massive 200 miles per hour musical instruments. Speaking of sounds, let me tell you about one of the most bizarre technical regulations of the decade. In 2005, the FIA introduced a rule that seemed simple on paper but created absolute chaos. In practice, teams were only allowed to use one set of tires for an entire race weekend, including qualifying. This meant that drivers had to complete practice sessions, qualifying, and the race on the same rubber compounds. The psychological pressure was immense. Imagine being a driver, knowing that one small mistake in practice could destroy your tires and ruin your entire weekend. Some drivers became so paranoid about tire wear that they would literally tiptoe around corners during practice sessions, barely pushing their cars at all. Others took the opposite approach, going all out in qualifying and hoping their tires would somehow survive the race. This rule created some of the most unpredictable races in F1 history. Cars that were lightning fast in qualifying would fall backwards during races as their tires degraded. Meanwhile, drivers who had conserved their rubber would suddenly find themselves fighting for podium positions. The 2005 United States Grand Prix became the ultimate example of how bizarre F1 had become when only 6 cars started the race due to tire safety concerns. But the tire situation was nothing compared to the refueling madness that defined this era. Cars would start races with wildly different fuel loads, creating a strategic puzzle that even the smartest engineers struggled to solve. Some cars would be carrying enough fuel to last half the race, while others would need to pit after just a few laps. This led to some absolutely insane moments. During the 2009 Hungarian Grand Prix, Heikki Kovalainen's McLaren caught fire during a pit stop when fuel spilled onto the hot exhaust system. The car was engulfed in flames within seconds, creating a terrifying scene that looked more like an action movie than a sporting event. Kovalainen escaped uninjured, but the incident highlighted just how dangerous the refueling process had become. The refueling era also created opportunities for mind games that would make a chess grandmaster proud. Teams would deliberately short fuel their cars to gain track position, hoping to undercut their rivals during pit stops. Other teams would load up with extra fuel and attempt to run longer than everyone else. The psychological warfare was intense, with teams trying to hide their true fuel loads from competitors through elaborate deception tactics. Fernando Alonso became a master of this fuel strategy game during his championship years with Renault. The team would often qualify their car in a seemingly impossible position, only to reveal during the race that they had been carrying significantly more fuel than their competitors. Alonso would maintain his position while others pitted, then emerge in the lead after his own stop. It was like watching a magic trick unfold at 200 miles per hour. But let's talk about some of the human stories that made this era so compelling. Michael Schumacher's dominance was legendary, but most people don't know about the physical toll it took on his body. During the 1999 British Grand Prix, Schumacher broke his leg in a high-speed crash at Stowe Corner. The injury was so severe that doctors initially feared he might never race again. What happened next was pure Schumacher madness. Instead of taking the recommended 6 months to recover, he was back in the car just 6 races later. But here's the crazy part. His leg hadn't fully healed. Schumacher had to have his foot specially modified to fit into the brake pedal, and he was racing with metal pins still in his leg. The pain was so intense that he needed special medication just to complete practice sessions. The Ferrari team was so desperate to have him back that they modified the car's pedal layout to accommodate his injury. They moved the brake pedal closer to his seat and adjusted the clutch position so he could operate it with his uninjured leg. Schumacher later admitted that he couldn't feel his injured leg properly for several races, essentially driving by muscle memory and pure determination. This wasn't even Schumacher's most bizarre medical situation of the decade. In 2005, he developed a mysterious illness that left him severely dehydrated and unable to concentrate properly. The Ferrari team tried everything to help him, including bringing in specialists from around the world. Eventually, they discovered that Schumacher had been accidentally poisoning himself with a new energy drink he'd been consuming. The drink contained a combination of ingredients that, when mixed with his regular medications, created a toxic reaction. Ferrari's technical innovations during this period were equally bizarre. The team developed a wind tunnel technique that involved using live insects to study airflow patterns around their cars. They would release thousands of fruit flies into the wind tunnel and use high-speed cameras to track their movement. The data they collected helped them understand turbulence in ways that traditional methods couldn't reveal. But Ferrari wasn't the only team pushing the boundaries of science and sanity. McLaren developed a system in the early 2000s that used magnetic fields to monitor tire temperatures in real time. The system was so sensitive that it could detect temperature changes of less than 1 degree across different sections of each tire. This information was transmitted to the pit wall, where engineers used it to make split-second strategy decisions. The system worked by embedding microscopic sensors into the tire compounds during manufacturing. These sensors would transmit data wirelessly to receivers mounted on the car's chassis. The technology was so advanced that it bordered on science fiction, and other teams accused McLaren of gaining an unfair advantage through what they called tire espionage. Speaking of espionage, the 2000s were filled with spy scandals that would make James Bond jealous. The most famous was the 2007 McLaren espionage case, where the team was caught with detailed Ferrari technical documents. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Teams were regularly accused of stealing data, bribing mechanics, and even planting spies in rival organizations. One of the most bizarre espionage stories involved Toyota's failed F1 program. The team spent over $1 billion during their 8 years in the sport, but never managed to win a single race. Part of their problem was an obsession with gathering intelligence on their competitors that bordered on paranoia. Toyota employed former intelligence agents and used satellite surveillance to monitor other teams' testing activities. The team's headquarters in Germany was equipped with secure communication systems and classified document storage facilities that looked more like a military installation than a racing team's base. Toyota engineers were required to sign non-disclosure agreements so comprehensive that they couldn't even tell their families what they were working on. Despite all this secrecy and surveillance, they still couldn't figure out how to build a winning car. But Toyota's struggles pale in comparison to the bizarre story of the Minardi team during this era. Minardi was everyone's favorite underdog, a small Italian team that somehow managed to survive on a budget that wouldn't cover other teams' coffee expenses. They became famous for their creative cost-cutting measures, which sometimes bordered on the absurd. During one particularly cash-strapped season, Minardi mechanics were instructed to save money by reusing everything possible. They would carefully remove every screw from crashed cars and sort them by size for future use. Old brake discs were melted down and reformed into new components. Even the team's hospitality unit was a converted school bus that owner Paul Stoddart had purchased for a few thousand euros. But Minardi's most bizarre cost-cutting measure involved their wind tunnel program. Unable to afford proper wind tunnel time, the team built a makeshift facility in an abandoned airplane hangar. They used industrial fans purchased from a home improvement store and created their own smoke generation system using dry ice and hair dryers. The setup was so primitive that team members had to manually adjust wind speeds by turning fans on and off during testing sessions. Despite these limitations, Minardi occasionally produced moments of pure magic. During the 2002 Australian Grand Prix, both Minardi cars finished in the points, earning the team their biggest payday in years. The celebration was so intense that Stoddart had to take out a loan just to pay for the victory party. The team spent more money celebrating their points finish than they had budgeted for the entire race weekend. The driver market during the 2000s was equally bizarre, with some of the most unusual career moves in F1 history. Kimi Raikkonen's journey from rally driving to F1 championship glory reads like fiction. When McLaren first signed him in 2001, Raikkonen had completed exactly 23 car races in his entire career. Most F1 drivers have more racing experience before they turn 16. Ron Dennis, McLaren's team principal, made the decision to sign Raikkonen based on a single test session at Silverstone. During that test, Raikkonen was so impressive that Dennis immediately offered him a contract, despite the fact that the young Finn could barely speak English and had never driven a Formula One car before that day. The FIA initially refused to grant Raikkonen a super license because of his limited experience, but McLaren's lobbying eventually convinced them to make an exception. Raikkonen's early F1 career was filled with bizarre moments that became legendary among fans. During his first season, he would often take naps between practice sessions, sometimes sleeping so deeply that mechanics had to physically shake him awake when it was time to drive. His pre-race routine included reading comic books and listening to heavy metal music at volumes that other drivers found disturbing. But Raikkonen wasn't the only driver with unusual habits. Juan Pablo Montoya became famous for his pre-race ritual of eating exactly 3 bananas while listening to Colombian folk music. He claimed the routine helped him achieve the perfect state of mental focus, and he was so superstitious about it that he would have bananas flown in from Colombia for races around the world. Montoya's aggressive driving style created some of the most spectacular moments of the decade. During the 2004 Brazilian Grand Prix, he attempted an overtaking maneuver so ambitious that even he later admitted it was probably impossible. He tried to pass 3 cars simultaneously on the outside of a corner, a move that required precision measured in millimeters. The attempt failed spectacularly, but the sheer audacity of it became legendary. The technical regulations during this era created opportunities for innovation that sometimes bordered on cheating. Teams would exploit loopholes in the rules to gain advantages that the regulators never anticipated. One of the most famous examples was the Brawn GP double diffuser controversy in 2009. When new technical regulations were introduced that year, most teams interpreted them as banning complex rear diffuser designs. But Brawn GP, along with Toyota and Williams, found a loophole that allowed them to create much larger diffuser openings. The advantage was enormous, giving these cars significantly more downforce than their competitors. The controversy raged for months, with other teams threatening legal action and demanding that the FIA ban the designs. But by the time the regulations were clarified, Brawn GP had already built an insurmountable championship lead. Jenson Button went on to win the driver's title, and Brawn won the Constructors' Championship in their only season of existence. The Brawn GP story itself is one of the most bizarre in F1 history. The team was essentially Honda's discarded remains, purchased by team principal Ross Brawn for a symbolic £1 after Honda decided to quit the sport. Most of the car had been developed by Honda's massive engineering team, but Brawn had to complete the project with a fraction of the original budget and workforce. The team had so little money that they couldn't afford to paint their cars properly. The distinctive yellow and black livery that became iconic was actually primer and basic paint chosen because it was the cheapest option available. Mechanics worked without pay for months, hoping that success on track would eventually lead to proper salaries. Button's championship campaign was equally improbable. He had spent years struggling with unreliable cars and was considering retirement when the Brawn opportunity arose. His contract was so basic that he was essentially driving for free, with payment dependent entirely on the team's success. When he clinched the championship, Button had earned less money than some rookie drivers in well-funded teams. The 2000s also saw some of the most dramatic season finales in F1 history. The 2008 championship battle between Lewis Hamilton and Felipe Massa came down to the final corner of the final lap of the final race. Hamilton needed to finish 5th or better to win his first title, but he was running 6th as the Brazilian Grand Prix entered its closing stages. With just a few corners remaining, Hamilton was on course to lose the championship by a single point. The tension was unbearable as both drivers pushed their cars to the absolute limit. Then, in one of the most dramatic moments in sports history, Timo Glock's Toyota slowed dramatically on the final lap due to tire problems, allowing Hamilton to sneak past and secure the 5th place finish he needed. The scenes that followed were pure chaos. Felipe Massa had already been declared champion by Ferrari's pit crew, and his family was celebrating in the grandstands. Brazilian fans were cheering, fireworks were exploding, and champagne was flowing. Then, gradually, the horrible truth dawned on everyone. Hamilton had somehow managed to finish 5th and steal the championship. The emotional whiplash was devastating for Massa and his family. Television cameras captured his father breaking down in tears as he realized his son had lost the title in the most heartbreaking way possible. Massa himself didn't learn the full story until several minutes after the race ended, making his disappointment even more profound. But even that dramatic finale couldn't match the bizarre circumstances surrounding the 2005 United States Grand Prix. The race became one of the most embarrassing moments in F1 history, when Michelin discovered that their tires were unsafe for the high-speed Indianapolis banking. After a series of failures during practice and qualifying, including a spectacular blowout that nearly killed Ralf Schumacher, Michelin advised all their teams not to participate in the race. What followed was a farcical attempt to find a solution that satisfied everyone. Teams proposed installing a chicane to slow cars down before the dangerous turn, but the FIA refused. Michelin offered to fly in different tires overnight, but regulations prevented tire changes between qualifying and the race. Various compromise solutions were suggested and rejected. creating a diplomatic crisis that threatened the future of F1 in America. In the end, only the 6 cars running Bridgestone tires participated in the race: the 2 Ferraris, 2 Jordans, and 2 Minardis. The remaining 14 cars completed the formation lap and then immediately returned to the pits, leaving just 6 cars to compete for victory. The fans, who had paid hundreds of dollars for tickets, were understandably furious, and many demanded refunds. The race itself was equally bizarre. With only 6 cars competing, everyone knew that barring mechanical failures, the finishing order would simply be determined by qualifying positions. Michael Schumacher won easily, followed by Rubens Barrichello in the 2nd Ferrari. The Jordan and Minardi drivers found themselves in the unprecedented position of guaranteed points finishes simply for completing the race distance. Indianapolis Motor Speedway officials were so embarrassed by the situation that they offered free tickets to the following year's race for everyone who attended the 2005 debacle. The gesture cost them millions of dollars, but helped preserve some goodwill with American fans who were already skeptical about Formula One's commitment to racing in the United States. Looking back at the 2000s now, it's clear that this decade represented a unique period in F1 history when technological innovation, regulatory confusion, and human drama combined to create some of the most memorable moments the sport has ever seen. The era gave us legendary champions like Schumacher, Alonso, Hamilton, and Button, while also producing some of the most bizarre stories and controversies that fans still discuss today. These weren't just racing cars. They were rolling laboratories, pushing the boundaries of physics, engineering, and human endurance. The drivers weren't just athletes. They were pioneers, exploring the limits of what was possible behind the wheel of the fastest machines on Earth. And the teams weren't just racing organizations. They were gladiatorial enterprises where millions of dollars and years of work could be won or lost in a split second of brilliance or disaster. The 2000s proved that in Formula One, truth really is stranger than fiction, and the most unbelievable stories are often the ones that actually happened. The year is 1982, and Keke Rosberg has just won the Formula One World Championship despite winning only a single race all season. But that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the absolutely mind-bending reality of Formula One in the 1,980 seconds. What I'm about to share with you will completely change how you think about this sport, because the 80s weren't just about fast cars and famous drivers. They were about pure chaos, technological madness, and moments so bizarre they sound like they were ripped straight from a fever dream. Picture this scenario for a moment. You're watching a Formula One race, and suddenly one of the cars starts accelerating so violently that it literally becomes airborne, launching into the sky like a rocket ship. The driver survives, but the car is completely destroyed. Sound impossible? Well, it actually happened, and it's just one of dozens of absolutely insane stories from this incredible decade that most fans have never heard before. The 1,980 seconds represented a perfect storm of circumstances that created the most unpredictable and dangerous era in Formula One history. New technology was being developed at breakneck speed. Safety regulations were practically non-existent by today's standards, and team owners were willing to try absolutely anything to gain a competitive advantage. The result was a decade where the impossible became routine, and where every single race weekend brought the potential for something completely unprecedented to occur. Let's start with something that sounds completely made up but is absolutely true. During the 1983 season, there was a driver named Andrea de Cesaris who became legendary for all the wrong reasons. This Italian driver managed to crash out of his first 14 Formula One races in a row, 14 consecutive retirements. To put this in perspective, most drivers would lose their seat after 2 or 3 crashes, but somehow de Cesaris kept getting hired. Teams would literally budget for replacement cars when they signed him because they knew with mathematical certainty that he would destroy whatever vehicle they gave him. But here's where it gets even more bizarre. Despite this absolutely terrible track record, de Cesaris actually had incredible raw speed. When he wasn't busy launching his car into barriers, catch fences, or other drivers, he was often posting times that put him near the front of the grid. It was like watching someone who could perform brain surgery but couldn't tie their own shoelaces. The man was a walking contradiction, who somehow managed to compete in Formula One for over a decade, despite being arguably the most crash-prone driver in the sport's history. Speaking of crashes, let's talk about what happened to Stefan Bellof at the 1985 Belgian Grand Prix. Beloff was considered one of the most promising young talents in motorsport, a driver who many believed would become a future world champion. During practice at the notoriously dangerous Spa-Francorchamps circuit, Beloff was pushing his Tyrrell to its absolute limits when something went catastrophically wrong. His car suffered a mechanical failure at over 200 miles per hour, sending it spinning wildly out of control. What happened next defies belief. The car hit a barrier with such tremendous force that it actually disintegrated on impact, breaking apart into hundreds of pieces that scattered across the track like confetti. But somehow, miraculously, Beloff walked away from the crash with only minor injuries. When asked about the experience later, he described it as being inside an explosion while traveling at highway speeds. The fact that he survived what essentially amounted to his race car being blown apart around him remains one of the most incredible escape stories in motorsport history. Now let's dive into the technological madness that defined this era. In 1986, Honda developed an engine for their Formula One program that produced so much power it was literally uncontrollable. This wasn't just a case of having too much horsepower for the available grip. This engine was so powerful that it would actually cause the rear wheels to spin at over 200 miles per hour on straightaways. Drivers reported that pressing the throttle pedal felt like grabbing onto a lightning bolt. The Honda engineers had created what was essentially a controlled explosion that happened to be attached to a race car. During testing, multiple drivers refused to even attempt qualifying laps because the car was so violent and unpredictable. One test driver described it as trying to ride a bucking bronco while someone fired a cannon behind your head. The engine was eventually banned, not because it was illegal, but because it was considered too dangerous for human beings to operate. But perhaps the most bizarre story from this decade involves what happened during the 1984 Monaco Grand Prix, which has to be seen to be believed. The race started in relatively normal conditions, but as the laps progressed, rain began falling on the circuit. In modern Formula One, this would trigger an immediate safety car period or potentially a red flag to stop the race. But in 1984, they just kept racing. As the rain intensified, the track became increasingly treacherous. Cars were sliding off the circuit with alarming regularity, but race control seemed determined to continue the event no matter what happened. By lap 30, visibility was so poor that drivers could barely see the car directly in front of them. Multiple competitors reported that they were essentially driving blind, using only the faint glow of taillights to navigate the track. Then, something extraordinary occurred. Ayrton Senna, who was relatively unknown at the time and driving for the small Toleman team, began threading his way through the field with supernatural skill. While seasoned veterans were spinning off the track or crawling along at cautious speeds, Senna was actually gaining time and overtaking multiple cars per lap. His performance in these conditions was so far beyond what anyone thought possible that some observers initially suspected his car had some kind of illegal traction control system. The race was eventually stopped due to the dangerous conditions, but not before Senna had climbed from 13th place to 2nd, passing some of the greatest drivers in the sport's history in conditions that most people wouldn't drive to the grocery store in. When asked about his performance afterward, Senna claimed he had experienced some kind of transcendent state where the car felt like an extension of his own body. He described feeling completely connected to the track surface through the steering wheel and being able to sense exactly how much grip was available at any given moment. This brings us to another completely insane aspect of 80s Formula One, the qualifying system. Today, qualifying is a structured session with specific time limits and clear procedures. But in the 1,980 seconds, they used a system that was so bizarre, it sounds like someone made it up as a joke. Teams were allowed to build special qualifying engines that were designed to last for exactly one flying lap and then completely destroy themselves. These engines produced incredible amounts of power for very short periods before literally exploding from the internal stresses. Drivers would do warm-up laps with conservative engine settings, then switch to what was called party mode for their qualifying attempt. The engine would unleash every bit of performance it was capable of producing, launching the car around the track at speeds that seemed to defy physics, before suffering catastrophic mechanical failure as the driver coasted back to the pits. BMW developed a qualifying engine that produced over 1,400 horsepower from a 1.5-liter turbocharged unit. To put this in perspective, modern Formula One engines produce around 1,000 horsepower from 1.6-liter, Hybrid power units, with 35 years of additional technological development. The BMW engine was so powerful that it would actually bend the chassis of the cars it was installed in, causing permanent structural damage with each qualifying run. The drivers who used these engines described the experience as barely controlled chaos. The acceleration was so violent that it would pin them back in their seats with forces typically associated with rocket launches. One driver compared it to being shot out of a cannon while sitting on top of a stick of dynamite. The engines would scream at ear-splitting volumes before inevitably destroying themselves in spectacular fashion, often with visible flames shooting from the exhaust pipes. Let's talk about another technological innovation that sounds like science fiction but was absolutely real. In 1983, Brabham developed a car that could actually change its weight distribution while driving around the track. This wasn't some kind of active suspension system or adjustable aerodynamics. This was a car that would literally dump water ballast during the race to become lighter and faster as fuel loads decreased. Here's how this insane system worked. The car would start the race carrying extra water in hidden tanks throughout the chassis. This additional weight helped with tire wear and handling in the early stages when the fuel tanks were full. But as the race progressed and the fuel burned off, the driver could activate a system that would gradually drain the water tanks, reducing the car's overall weight and improving performance. The really crazy part is that this was completely legal under the technical regulations of the time. The rules required cars to meet minimum weight requirements, but they didn't specify when those requirements had to be met. So Brabham found a way to be heavy when it helped them, and light when it helped them, all within the same race. It was like having a car that could change its fundamental characteristics on command. This system worked so well that other teams immediately began developing their own versions. Soon, you had cars with elaborate water tank systems, oil reservoir tricks, and other methods of manipulating weight distribution during races. The paddock started to resemble a chemistry lab more than a racing facility, with teams constantly measuring fluid levels and calculating optimal drainage timing. But perhaps the most mind-blowing story from this era involves what happened to Nelson Piquet during the 1987 San Marino Grand Prix. Piquet was leading the race and looking set for a comfortable victory when his car developed what appeared to be a minor mechanical problem. The engine began making unusual noises, but the telemetry showed everything was within normal parameters, so his team told him to continue racing. As the laps progressed, the noises became more pronounced, but Piquet was still setting competitive lap times and maintaining his lead. Then, with just 10 laps remaining, something absolutely extraordinary happened. The engine didn't just fail in a normal way. Instead, it began running backward. The internal components had shifted in such a way that the engine was actually producing power in reverse while somehow still propelling the car forward. Piquet later described the sensation as completely surreal. The car was still moving in the right direction at racing speeds, but all of the engine sounds and vibrations were completely wrong. It was like driving a car that had been possessed by some kind of mechanical demon. He managed to nurse the car home for the victory, but post-race inspection revealed that his engine had essentially rebuilt itself into a completely different configuration while he was driving. The technical explanation for what happened involves extremely complex engineering principles that most people, including many professional mechanics, still don't fully understand. Essentially, the engine had suffered a series of failures that individually should have been catastrophic, but which combined in such a way that they actually created a new method of operation. It's the automotive equivalent of a person losing their arms and legs, but somehow developing the ability to fly. Now, let's discuss the absolute madness of turbo lag in 80s. Formula One. Modern turbocharged engines have virtually eliminated the delay between pressing the throttle and receiving power, but in the 1,980 seconds, turbo lag was a fact of life that created some truly bizarre racing situations. Drivers had to learn to press the accelerator pedal several seconds before they actually wanted the power to arrive, essentially predicting their future power needs. This led to some incredible strategic complexities that made racing look more like chess than motorsport. Drivers would begin accelerating for corners they hadn't even reached yet, calculating exactly when the turbo would spool up to provide maximum power at the optimal moment. Get the timing wrong by even a fraction of a second, and you'd either have no power when you needed it or too much power when the car couldn't handle it. The most extreme example of this occurred during the 1985 Portuguese Grand Prix, where Alain Prost actually began his qualifying lap preparation 3 corners before his official lap time would begin counting. He had to start building turbo pressure that early to ensure he would have maximum power available when he crossed the start-finish line. It was like watching someone play a musical instrument where every note had to be anticipated several beats in advance. Some drivers became absolute masters of managing turbo lag, developing an almost supernatural ability to predict exactly when and how much power would arrive. They could modulate the throttle in ways that would keep the turbo spinning at optimal speeds throughout entire lap sequences, creating what essentially amounted to a secondary racing line that existed purely in Wellbam terms of power management rather than physical track position. Let's talk about ground effect aerodynamics, which created some of the most visually spectacular and dangerous moments in motorsport history. Cars in the early 1980 seconds used innovative aerodynamic designs that literally sucked themselves down to the track surface using air pressure differentials. This created incredible amounts of downforce and cornering speeds that seemed to defy the laws of physics. But the system had one catastrophic weakness. If the aerodynamic seal was broken for any reason, cars would instantly lose enormous amounts of grip and become completely uncontrollable. This could happen due to mechanical failure, contact with another car, or even just hitting a bump in the track at the wrong angle. When it occurred, drivers described it as having the road disappear from underneath them while traveling at 200 miles per hour. The most terrifying aspect of ground effect failures was their unpredictability. A car could be cornering at seemingly impossible speeds one moment and then suddenly launch into the air the next, with no warning whatsoever. Drivers developed techniques for recognizing the early signs of aerodynamic failure, but by the time they could react, it was usually too late to prevent a massive crash. One driver described losing ground effect as feeling like the car had suddenly been transformed from a race car into a projectile. The transition was so abrupt and violent that it would literally throw drivers against their safety harnesses with tremendous force. Some competitors reported temporary blackouts from the sudden deceleration forces when their cars went from having massive amounts of grip to having virtually none. Finally, let's discuss the bizarre qualifying culture that developed around these technological marvels. Since engines were designed to last for single runs, qualifying sessions became elaborate theatrical performances where teams would wheel their cars out at precisely calculated moments, fire them up for exactly the right amount of time, and then shut them down before they could destroy themselves. The paddock during qualifying would sound like a war zone, with engines screaming at maximum output for brief periods before falling silent forever. Mechanics would literally count down the seconds until engine failure was expected, signaling drivers to abort their runs moments before catastrophic mechanical failure occurred. It was like watching a sport where the equipment was designed to self-destruct as part of the competition. Teams developed elaborate timing strategies based on track conditions, tire temperatures, fuel loads, and engine life cycles. Some would wait until the final minutes of qualifying to make their attempts, gambling that track conditions would improve enough to justify the risk of having no backup plan if something went wrong. Others would make multiple attempts early in the session, accepting lower performance in exchange for having contingency options available. The 1,980 seconds in Formula One represented a unique moment in motorsport history where technology advanced faster than safety regulations could keep up, creating a perfect storm of innovation, danger, and absolute insanity that will never be repeated. These stories represent just a tiny fraction of the bizarre reality that defined this incredible decade when Formula One was less a sport than a high-speed experiment in human endurance and mechanical impossibility. You think you know Formula One, but I guarantee these 1,990 seconds facts will blow your mind and make you question everything you thought you understood about the sport. Picture this: drivers smuggling illegal technology past officials using fake components, teams spending fortunes on systems so advanced they bordered on science fiction, and race weekends where the cars themselves became more famous than the drivers behind the wheel. The 90s weren't just about speed. They were about an era so wild and technologically insane that modern F1 looks tame by comparison. Let me take you back to a decade where innovation met desperation, where brilliant minds pushed every boundary imaginable, and where the line between genius and madness became completely blurred. These aren't your typical F1 trivia facts. These are the stories that even hardcore fans have never heard, the secrets that teams tried to bury, and the moments that shaped motorsport forever. Starting with something that sounds like pure science fiction, did you know that in 1993, McLaren developed a system called the fiddle brake that was so revolutionary, it essentially gave their drivers a third pedal? But here's where it gets absolutely insane. This wasn't just any ordinary braking system. The fiddle brake allowed drivers to brake individual rear wheels independently during cornering, giving them supernatural control through turns that physics shouldn't have allowed. The system worked by installing a secondary brake pedal that drivers could operate with their left foot while simultaneously using the main brake pedal with their right. Imagine trying to coordinate that level of complexity while traveling at 200 miles per hour, making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. Ayrton Senna, who was driving for McLaren at the time, reportedly took weeks to master the technique, practicing the dual pedal coordination until it became second nature. But the truly bizarre part isn't just that this technology existed, it's how McLaren managed to keep it secret for an entire season. They installed fake components in areas where competitors might look, created decoy systems to throw off rival teams, and even had their mechanics practice elaborate cover-up procedures during pit stops. The lengths they went to protect this advantage reads like a spy novel rather than a sports story. The system gave McLaren such a significant advantage that other teams suspected something was happening but couldn't figure out what. Race after race, McLaren cars would take corners at impossible speeds, braking later than anyone thought possible, and maintaining grip in situations where other cars would lose control. Competitors were convinced McLaren had discovered some secret about aerodynamics or tire compound. Never suspecting the truth lay in a completely revolutionary approach to braking technology. When the system was eventually discovered and banned, it marked the end of one of the most sophisticated cheating schemes in motorsport history. Yet calling it cheating isn't entirely fair, because technically, McLaren had found a loophole in regulations that nobody had considered. The rules didn't specifically prohibit independent rear-wheel braking systems because nobody had imagined such technology was even possible. Moving from secret brake systems to something even more outrageous, let's talk about active suspension, a technology so advanced that it made cars behave like they were defying the laws of physics. Williams pioneered this system in the early 90s, creating vehicles that could maintain perfect ride height regardless of fuel load, track conditions, or speed variations. Active suspension worked through a network of computer-controlled hydraulic actuators that adjusted each wheel's position hundreds of times per second. The system used sensors to monitor track conditions, cornering forces, and vehicle dynamics, then made microscopic adjustments to keep the car in optimal position. The result was cars that looked like they were floating above the track surface, maintaining perfect aerodynamic efficiency through every corner and straight. But here's where the story becomes truly bizarre. The active suspension systems were so sophisticated that they required their own dedicated computer programmers who traveled with the teams. These weren't traditional mechanics or engineers, but software specialists who spent race weekends hunched over laptops, writing code that would be uploaded to the cars minutes before qualifying sessions. Nigel Mansell, driving for Williams in 1992, described the experience as supernatural. He said the car would anticipate bumps and surface changes before he could feel them, automatically adjusting suspension settings to maintain perfect grip and balance. During that season, Mansell won 9 out of 16 races, often by margins so large that it seemed like he was driving in a completely different category than his competitors. The technology became so advanced that Williams developed predictive algorithms that could analyze track data from previous years and pre-program suspension settings for specific corners. The car would literally know what was coming before reaching each section of track, adjusting itself proactively rather than reactively. It was like having a crystal ball integrated into the suspension system. Other teams desperately tried to copy this technology, leading to some of the most expensive development programs in F1 history. Ferrari reportedly spent over $50 million trying to develop their own active suspension system, hiring computer programmers from aerospace companies, and investing in supercomputers just to run suspension simulations. The arms race became so intense that by 1993, teams were spending more money on suspension development than on engine programs. McLaren's active suspension system required a dedicated truck just to transport the computer equipment needed to run it. The hydraulic pumps were so powerful they could lift the entire car 6 inches off the ground, and drivers reported feeling like they were riding in elevators rather than race cars. But perhaps the most bizarre aspect was how the technology affected driver psychology. Several drivers reported feeling disconnected from their cars, as if the vehicle was making decisions independently. Some complained that the active suspension made racing feel artificial, like playing a video game rather than driving a real car. The technology was so effective at eliminating driver errors that it began raising philosophical questions about what Formula One racing was supposed to represent. Now let's dive into something that sounds completely made up but is absolutely true. In 1994, Benetton developed a system called launch control that could execute perfect race starts without any driver input whatsoever. The system was programmed to control throttle, clutch, and gear changes during the first few seconds after the start lights went out, essentially turning drivers into passengers for the most critical moment of every race. Launch control worked by analyzing track conditions, tire temperatures, and fuel loads, then calculating the mathematically perfect launch sequence. When the start lights disappeared, the system would engage automatically, controlling wheel spin, optimizing gear changes, and managing power delivery with precision no human driver could match. It was like having a robot take over your car for the race start, then hand control back once optimal acceleration was achieved. The truly insane part is how teams hid this technology from race officials. Benetton programmed their launch control system to activate only under specific conditions that were unlikely to occur during official inspections. The software included elaborate masking routines that would hide the illegal code unless accessed through secret key, combinations that only team programmers knew. Michael Schumacher, driving for Benetton at the time, would sit in his car before race starts, knowing that he didn't actually need to do anything for the first few seconds. He could focus entirely on planning his strategy for the first corner, while the computer handled the complex task of achieving optimal acceleration. Other drivers would be frantically managing throttle and clutch inputs, while Schumacher could remain completely calm and relaxed. The system gave Benetton such a significant advantage that Schumacher consistently gained multiple positions in the first few seconds of races. Competitors noticed that Benetton cars seemed to launch with supernatural consistency, never suffering from wheel spin or stalled engines that plagued other teams. Race after race, Schumacher would rocket from his starting position with acceleration that seemed to defy mechanical limitations. What makes this story even more bizarre is that launch control was technically legal when Benetton first developed it, but was banned partway through the 1994 season. However, evidence suggests that Benetton continued using the system even after it was prohibited, hiding the illegal software in ways that took investigators months to uncover. The scandal eventually contributed to some of the most controversial moments in F1 history, including questions about whether technological advantages influence championship outcomes. But wait, because we're just getting started with the technological insanity of 90s Formula One. Let's talk about something called traction control, a system so advanced that it made cars virtually undrivable for anyone except the most skilled drivers, while simultaneously making those same cars impossibly fast in the right hands. Traction control systems in the 90s were nothing like the simple electronic aids we know today. These were sophisticated programs that monitored dozens of sensors simultaneously, analyzing wheel speeds, throttle inputs, steering angles, and even suspension movements to detect the earliest signs of tire slip. When the system detected loss of traction, it would make instant adjustments to power delivery, sometimes cutting engine power for mere milliseconds at a time. The bizarre part is that early traction control systems were so aggressive that they made cars actively fight against their drivers. Imagine pressing the accelerator and having the car refuse to respond, or feeling the engine cut power dozens of times per second as you try to accelerate out of corners. Drivers reported that learning to work with traction control was like learning to drive all over again, requiring completely different techniques and mental approaches. McLaren's traction control system in 1993 was so sophisticated that it could predict tire slip before it actually occurred, preemptively adjusting power delivery based on cornering forces and track conditions. The system used neural network algorithms that learned from each lap, becoming more effective as the race weekend progressed. By Sunday's race, the car would know exactly how much power could be applied at every point on the track. Ayrton Senna initially hated the technology, claiming it removed the artistry from driving and made racing feel mechanical. However, once he learned to work with the system, he discovered that it allowed him to push beyond what he had previously thought possible. He could attack corners with unprecedented aggression, knowing that the traction control would prevent catastrophic mistakes while allowing him to maintain speeds that would have been impossible without electronic assistance. The development cost became absolutely astronomical as teams tried to outprogram each other. Ferrari hired software engineers from NASA, McLaren recruited programmers from military defense contractors, and Williams brought in specialists from Formula One's first computer simulation companies. The computational requirements became so intense that teams needed dedicated air conditioning systems just to cool their onboard computers. Some of the most bizarre moments came from system malfunctions that would cause cars to behave in completely unpredictable ways. Drivers reported instances where traction control systems would activate randomly on straightaways, cutting power for no apparent reason. Other malfunctions would cause the system to become hyperactive, cutting power so frequently that cars would become virtually undrivable. The psychological impact on drivers was profound and often overlooked. Many veteran drivers struggled to adapt to systems that second-guessed their every input, while younger drivers, who learned with electronic aids, sometimes couldn't drive effectively when the systems failed. It created a generational divide in the sport that lasted for years, with some drivers becoming dependent on electronic assistance, while others never fully trusted the technology. But perhaps nothing captures the sheer insanity of 90s F1 technology like the story of ground effect aerodynamics, a concept so powerful that it was banned not once, but multiple times as teams found increasingly creative ways to circumvent regulations. Ground effect works by creating a low-pressure area beneath the car, essentially sucking it down onto the track surface with forces that can exceed the car's own weight. Teams in the early 90s discovered that they could create ground effect through subtle modifications to the car's underbody, using techniques that were nearly impossible for officials to detect. They would shape the floor panels with microscopic precision, creating venturi tunnels that generated massive downforce without obviously violating technical regulations. The cars would produce grip levels that seemed to defy physics, taking corners at speeds that should have resulted in immediate crashes. Lotus developed a system they called active ground effect, which combined traditional ground effect principles with active suspension technology. Their cars could adjust ride height dynamically to optimize the ground effect at different speeds, essentially giving them variable downforce that could be tuned for each corner. On long straightaways, the car would rise slightly to reduce drag, then lower itself before corners to maximize grip. The truly bizarre aspect was how drivers described the sensation of extreme ground effect. They reported feeling like the car was being pulled downward by invisible forces, as if the track surface was magnetic. Some drivers said it felt like driving upside down, with the car wanting to stick to any surface it approached. The grip levels were so extreme that drivers could take certain corners at full throttle, something that had never been possible in the history of motorsport. Adrian Newey, who was designing cars for March at the time, later described the era as a period when aerodynamics became more important than mechanical engineering. Teams were hiring fluid dynamics specialists from aerospace companies, using wind tunnel time that cost thousands of dollars per hour, and developing computational models that required supercomputers to process. The secrecy surrounding aerodynamic development reached almost paranoid levels. Teams would cover their cars completely between sessions, use decoy components during practice, and even employ security guards to prevent competitors from photographing specific areas of their vehicles. Some teams went so far as to develop fake aerodynamic components that looked functional but were actually designed to mislead rival engineers. McLaren's 1998 car was so aerodynamically advanced that it generated more downforce than many modern F1 cars, despite being designed over 25 years ago. The car could theoretically drive upside down at speeds above 120 miles per hour, with sufficient downforce to overcome gravity itself. When drivers first tested these cars, they reported feeling physical sensations they had never experienced, as if the laws of physics were being rewritten around them. The cost of aerodynamic development became so extreme that smaller teams couldn't compete, leading to a technological divide that threatened the sport's competitive balance. Wind tunnel programs that cost millions of dollars became mandatory for competitive performance, while teams without access to advanced computational resources found themselves seconds per lap behind the leaders. But the most mind-bending aspect of 90s F1 technology was how all these systems worked together. Imagine a car with active suspension that adjusted hundreds of times per second, traction control that managed power delivery with millisecond precision, launch control that executed perfect race starts, and ground effect aerodynamics that generated supernatural grip levels. The cars became technological marvels that pushed the boundaries of what was mechanically possible. Drivers from that era often describe it as the most challenging and rewarding period in F1 history, when mastering the technology was just as important as traditional driving skills. The cars required completely different techniques, mental approaches, and physical conditioning than anything that had come before. It was like learning to pilot spacecraft rather than drive racing cars. The legacy of 90s F1 technology continues to influence motorsport today, though much of it remains banned due to cost and safety concerns. Modern F1 cars use simplified versions of these systems, but nothing approaches the technological sophistication and sheer audacity of what teams achieved during that incredible decade. It remains a testament to human ingenuity, engineering brilliance, and the relentless pursuit of speed that defines Formula One racing. Those 10 years changed motorsport forever, creating legends, bankrupting teams, and producing some of the most spectacular racing ever witnessed. The technology was so advanced that we're still discovering details about systems that were kept secret for decades, making the 1,990 seconds the most fascinating technological period in F1 history. Have you ever wondered what Formula One was like when drivers literally had to dodge flying body parts during races? Welcome back to the channel. And today we're diving into the absolutely insane world of 1,970 seconds Formula One racing, where death was a weekly possibility, cars regularly exploded, and some of the most bizarre incidents in motorsport history became just another Tuesday at the office. Before we jump into this wild ride through racing's most dangerous decade, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because trust me, after hearing these stories, you'll want to stick around for more incredible motorsport content that'll blow your mind. The 1,970 seconds weren't just a different era for Formula One. They were practically a different sport entirely. Picture this. Drivers showing up to races, knowing there was a genuine chance they wouldn't make it home for dinner. Mechanics working on cars that were essentially bombs on wheels, and safety measures that would make today's health inspectors faint on the spot. Let's start with something that sounds like it's straight out of a horror movie. During the 1970 Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort, driver Piers Courage was racing when his car suddenly veered off the track and burst into flames. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Spectators actually tried to help put out the fire by throwing beer on it. Yes, you heard that right. Beer. Because apparently, in 1970, the emergency response plan at Formula One races included hoping drunk fans would share their beverages with burning race cars. The safety standards of the era were so laughably inadequate that drivers regularly competed with fuel tanks that were basically time bombs strapped to their backs. These cars carried up to 200 liters of highly flammable fuel in thin aluminum tanks with no safety cells, no fire suppression systems, and certainly no modern crash protection. When these things went wrong, they went spectacularly wrong. Take the 1973 Dutch Grand Prix, where Roger Williamson's car flipped and caught fire. David Purley, showing incredible bravery, stopped his own race and desperately tried to flip the burning car back over to save his fellow driver. For several agonizing minutes, television cameras captured Purley single-handedly attempting to rescue Williamson, while marshals stood around seemingly unsure of what to do. The lack of proper safety equipment and training was so severe that one man's heroic efforts weren't enough, and Williamson tragically lost his life while Purley received burns trying to save him. But it wasn't just the crashes that were bizarre. It was how casually everyone treated them. Drivers would walk away from accidents that should have killed them, dust themselves off, and ask when the next practice session started. Clay Regazzoni once crashed so hard that his car disintegrated around him, leaving him sitting in what was essentially just a seat attached to an engine. His response? He waved to the crowd and asked if anyone had seen his steering wheel. The cars themselves were engineering marvels that also happened to be death traps. The legendary Lotus 72, driven by Emerson Fittipaldi to 2 world championships, had a design quirk that would horrify modern safety experts. The fuel tanks were positioned on either side of the driver, meaning that in a side impact, you were literally sitting between 2 giant containers of explosive liquid. Jochen Rindt, who posthumously became the only driver to win a world championship after dying, was killed when his Lotus 72's safety belts failed during a crash, allowing him to slide down in the cockpit and suffer fatal injuries from the poorly designed safety barriers. Speaking of safety barriers, let's talk about what passed for crash protection in the 1,970 seconds. Many circuits used Armco barriers that were essentially steel ribbons designed to keep cars on the track, not protect drivers. When cars hit these barriers, they would often slice through them like cheese or get launched into the air. The famous banking at Monza had barriers that were so poorly designed that cars would sometimes vault over them entirely, landing in areas filled with spectators. The medical facilities at races were equally primitive. Most circuits had what amounted to a first aid station with maybe 1 doctor and some bandages. When Niki Lauda suffered his horrific crash at the Nürburgring in 1976, he was pulled from his burning Ferrari by fellow drivers and marshals with their bare hands. The medical helicopter that was supposed to evacuate him couldn't land properly, and he was driven to the hospital in the back of a van. The fact that Lauda survived, let alone returned to racing just 6 weeks later with his face still heavily bandaged, is nothing short of miraculous. But perhaps the most bizarre aspect of 1,970 seconds Formula One was how the drivers themselves approached the constant threat of death. They developed a dark humor and casual attitude toward danger that would seem psychotic today. James Hunt once described racing as controlled madness and regularly showed up to races hungover from the night before. He wasn't alone. Many drivers treated Formula One weekends like extended parties, hitting nightclubs between practice sessions and showing up to qualifying with bloodshot eyes and questionable decision-making abilities. The cars were so unreliable that mechanical failures were just as dangerous as crashes. Gearboxes would explode without warning, sending metal shrapnel flying through the cockpit. Suspension components would snap at 180 miles per hour, instantly turning a race car into an uncontrollable missile. Engines would seize up so violently that they would sometimes rip themselves out of their mountings entirely. One of the most surreal aspects of the era was how teams dealt with these constant mechanical failures. Mechanics would literally rebuild entire cars overnight, using parts cannibalized from wrecked vehicles. It wasn't uncommon for a driver to climb into what was technically a completely different car than the one they had practiced in, assembled from the remains of several others. The quality control was so hit or miss that drivers would sometimes discover critical components were missing only after they were already racing at full speed. The tire technology of the 1,970 seconds was equally terrifying. The wide, slick tires that made the cars so fast also made them incredibly unpredictable. A tire failure at high speed would often result in the car becoming completely uncontrollable, with no modern electronic aids to help the driver maintain any semblance of direction. Drivers would describe the experience of a tire blowout as being like someone suddenly cutting the strings on a marionette while it was in mid-dance. Weather conditions made everything even more dangerous. There were no sophisticated weather radar systems or detailed meteorological reports. Rain races were absolute chaos, with visibility so poor that drivers literally couldn't see the car in front of them. The 1,976 Japanese Grand Prix at Fuji Speedway was held in conditions so treacherous that several drivers refused to race, calling it suicidal. Those who did race described it as driving blind through a typhoon while trying to navigate by instinct and prayer. The politics and personalities of 1,970 seconds Formula One were just as wild as the racing itself. Team owners were often larger-than-life characters who treated their drivers like gladiators in an ancient Roman arena. Colin Chapman of Lotus was known for his innovative but often dangerous designs, creating cars that were incredibly fast but had a disturbing tendency to fall apart without warning. His philosophy seemed to be that anything that didn't break wasn't light enough, an approach that produced both championship-winning cars and several tragic accidents. The media coverage of the era was equally bizarre by today's standards. Television cameras would focus on crashes with an intensity that would be considered tasteless today. and commentators would discuss driver deaths with a matter-of-fact tone that seems almost callous in hindsight. The famous ABC Wide World of Sports opening sequence included footage of a ski jumper's horrific crash, and Formula One received similar treatment. Spectacular accidents were considered good television, regardless of the human cost. Perhaps most incredibly, many of the drivers from this era look back on it with genuine nostalgia. They talk about the purity of the racing, the lack of electronic aids, and the raw skill required to handle these mechanical monsters. Jackie Stewart, who became a major advocate for safety improvements after surviving the era, still describes the racing as more authentic and challenging than modern Formula One. The transformation that began in the late 1970 seconds and continued into the 1980 seconds was nothing short of revolutionary. The introduction of proper safety cells, fire suppression systems, improved barriers, and better medical facilities gradually transformed Formula One from a gladiatorial spectacle into something resembling a legitimate sport. The fact that no Formula One driver has died during a race weekend since 1994 is a testament to how far the sport has come from those wild early days. But here's what makes the 1970 seconds truly fascinating. Despite all the danger, all the mechanical failures, and all the bizarre accidents, it produced some of the greatest drivers and most memorable racing in the sport's history. The combination of raw talent, primitive technology, and genuine danger created a unique environment where only the very best could survive and thrive. The drivers who emerged from this era weren't just skilled racers. They were survivors who had faced down death on a weekly basis and developed an almost supernatural ability to read danger and react instantly. Their car control skills were honed by necessity. There were no computer aids to save them when things went wrong. So they had to develop an intuitive understanding of physics and mechanical limits that modern drivers, for all their talent, rarely need to develop. Looking back at 1970 seconds Formula One is like examining artifacts from an alien civilization. The risks they accepted as normal, the dangers they treated as routine, and the attitudes they maintained in the face of constant peril seem almost incomprehensible today. Yet it was precisely this combination of incredible danger and human determination that created some of the most compelling stories in all of motorsport. The legacy of this era extends far beyond the track. The safety improvements developed in response to the tragedies of the 1970 seconds have saved countless lives, not just in Formula One, but in road cars around the world. The crash structures, safety cells, and impact-absorbing materials that we take for granted today were developed through the hard-learned lessons of an era when drivers paid the ultimate price for automotive progress. So the next time you watch a modern Formula One race and marvel at the precision, the safety, and the technological sophistication, remember that it all grew from the wild, dangerous, and absolutely bizarre world of 1970 seconds racing, where heroes were made not just by their speed, but by their ability to survive another day in the most dangerous sport on Earth. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through Formula One's most insane decade. If you enjoyed learning about these wild stories from racing's past, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing motorsport content. What other crazy racing stories would you like to hear about? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video. Picture this. It's 1968, and Formula One driver Joe Siffert is racing at over 150 miles per hour while smoking a cigarette behind the wheel. This actually happened. And it's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the absolutely insane world of 1960 seconds Formula One racing. Today, we're diving into the most bizarre, shocking, and downright unbelievable facts about F1 in the 60s that will completely change how you view modern racing. The 1960 seconds were a time when Formula One was essentially a death sport disguised as entertainment. Drivers were dying at an alarming rate. Safety was practically non-existent, and the stories that emerged from this era are so wild, they sound like fiction. But trust me, everything you're about to hear actually happened. Let's start with something that will blow your mind. In the 1960 seconds, Formula One cars didn't have seatbelts. You heard that right. Drivers were racing at speeds that would make your daily commute look like a leisurely stroll, and they weren't even strapped in. The reasoning behind this was absolutely terrifying. Teams and drivers believed that in the event of a crash, it was better to be thrown clear of the car rather than trapped inside what could potentially become a burning metal coffin. This philosophy led to some of the most horrific accidents in motorsport history. When a driver crashed, they would often be ejected from their car like a human projectile, sometimes landing dozens of feet away from the wreckage. The survival rate was essentially a coin flip, and drivers knew this every time they climbed into their cockpit. But here's where it gets even more bizarre. Despite the obvious dangers, drivers in the 1,960 seconds treated racing like a casual Sunday drive. Many would light up cigarettes during races. Not just Joe Siffert, but multiple drivers across the grid. Some would even drink alcohol before races, believing it would calm their nerves and improve their performance. Imagine trying to explain that to a modern F1 driver who follows strict dietary regimens and has teams of doctors monitoring their every vital sign. The cars themselves were mechanical marvels of insanity. In 1966, Formula One introduced the 3-liter engine formula, which sounds reasonable until you realize that some teams were creating monsters that produced over 400 horsepower while weighing less than 1,200 pounds. These cars had the power-to-weight ratio of modern supercars, but with the safety features of a shopping cart. The Lotus 49, introduced in 1967, was revolutionary not just for its speed, but for its construction. It was one of the first cars to use the engine as a stressed member of the chassis, meaning the engine literally helped hold the car together. If the engine failed, the car could potentially fall apart around the driver. This was considered acceptable risk in an era where innovation trumped safety every single time. Speaking of Lotus, their founder, Colin Chapman, had a philosophy that would make modern safety inspectors have nightmares. He believed in making cars as light as possible, famously saying that the perfect race car would fall apart immediately after crossing the finish line in first place. His cars were engineering masterpieces that pushed the absolute limits of materials science, often with terrifying results. The tire situation in 1,960 seconds F1 was equally absurd. Drivers would regularly experience tire failures at high speeds, not because of poor construction, but because the compounds couldn't handle the forces being generated. Tire changes during races were performed without any safety barriers between the crews and passing cars. Mechanics would dash onto the track with cars still racing past at full speed, armed with nothing but a jack and a prayer. Here's something that will make you question everything about modern racing. In the 1,960 seconds, Formula One races were often held on public roads that were only temporarily closed for racing. The Monaco Grand Prix was obviously one example, but races like the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring took place on a track that was over 14 miles long and featured 154 corners. Drivers had to memorize every single turn, elevation change, and potential hazard across those 14 miles, knowing that one mistake could mean instant death. The Nürburgring was particularly notorious because it was impossible for marshals to monitor the entire circuit. Drivers could crash in remote sections and remain undiscovered for significant periods of time. There are documented cases of drivers walking away from crashes and hitchhiking back to the pits because no one knew they had crashed in the first place. Medical support during 1,960 seconds races was laughably inadequate by today's standards. Many circuits had a single ambulance, and medical personnel often consisted of local volunteers with basic first aid training. When serious accidents occurred, drivers might wait precious minutes for help to arrive, assuming help could even reach them on some of the more remote circuits. The psychological toll on drivers was immense. They developed a fatalistic attitude that bordered on the supernatural. Many drivers had superstitious rituals they performed before races, wearing lucky charms or following specific routines because they genuinely believed these actions could be the difference between life and death. Some drivers would write letters to their families before every race, fully expecting they might not return home. Jim Clark, widely considered one of the greatest drivers of all time, once estimated that he had about a 50-50 chance of surviving any given racing season. This wasn't hyperbole, it was a statistical reality that drivers accepted as part of their profession. The fact that some drivers had long careers was more a testament to luck than skill, though skill certainly played a role. The financial aspects of 1,960 seconds Formula One were equally bizarre. Many drivers were essentially paying to race rather than being paid to race. Wealthy gentleman drivers would buy their way onto teams, sometimes with catastrophic results for both themselves and their competitors. The skill gap between professional drivers and paying amateurs was enormous, but money talked louder than talent in many cases. Team budgets were minuscule compared to modern standards. Entire teams operated on what modern F1 teams might spend on catering for a single race weekend. This led to some creative solutions that ranged from ingenious to terrifying. Teams would modify streetcar parts for racing use, sometimes with unexpected consequences when these parts failed under racing conditions. The relationship between drivers and team owners was dramatically different as well. Drivers were expected to be mechanics, test drivers, and marketers all rolled into one. Many drivers would work on their own cars, not out of passion, but out of necessity. The idea of a driver having a dedicated team of engineers analyzing their every input would have seemed like science fiction. Weather conditions added another layer of danger that modern viewers can barely comprehend. Races were rarely postponed for weather, regardless of conditions. Drivers raced in torrential rain with tires that provided minimal grip, on tracks with no drainage systems. Visibility would drop to near zero, but races continued because stopping meant losing money that teams couldn't afford to lose. The 1968 German Grand Prix is a perfect example of this insanity. The race was held in thick fog that reduced visibility to less than 50 feet. Drivers were essentially racing blind, using the sound of other cars' engines to gauge their position relative to competitors. Multiple accidents occurred, but the race continued until its scheduled conclusion. Sponsorship in the 1960 seconds was virtually non-existent compared to modern F1. Teams were painted in national colors rather than corporate liveries. The British racing green of teams like Lotus, the red of Ferrari, the silver of German manufacturers created a visual identity that was more about national pride than commercial interests. When tobacco sponsorship finally arrived in the late 1960 seconds, it was considered revolutionary. The technical regulations were also far more lenient than today's strictly controlled formula. Teams could experiment with radical aerodynamic concepts, engine configurations, and chassis designs that would never pass modern safety inspections. The Chaparral 2 Jules, while technically a sports car, exemplified the kind of innovative thinking that was possible when regulations were minimal. Teams in F1 tried similar extreme concepts, sometimes with spectacular failures. Driver fitness was an afterthought in the 1960 seconds. While modern F1 drivers are elite athletes with training regimens that rival Olympic competitors, 1960 seconds, drivers were often regular people who happened to be exceptionally brave and skilled at controlling powerful machines. Some drivers smoked regularly, many drank alcohol, and few followed any structured fitness program. This casual approach to physical conditioning became problematic as races grew longer and more demanding. Drivers would sometimes become exhausted during races, leading to mistakes that could prove fatal. The physical demands of wrestling an unassisted steering car around a circuit for over 2 hours while experiencing multiple G-forces took a toll that many drivers were unprepared for. The prize money structure was equally bizarre. Winners might receive a few $1,000s for risking their lives, while modern F1 drivers earn millions per season. The financial incentive was so low that many drivers maintained other careers or businesses to support their racing habits. This part-time approach to what was supposedly the pinnacle of motorsport seems absurd by today's standards. Communication between drivers and teams was primitive at best. There were no radio systems, no telemetry, and no real-time data collection. Teams relied on hand signals from pit boards to communicate with drivers, assuming the drivers could see and interpret these signals while racing. Strategic decisions had to be made with incomplete information and implemented through crude communication methods. The 1960 seconds also saw some of the most innovative cheating in Formula One history. Teams would find creative ways to circumvent regulations, sometimes with dangerous consequences. Weight limits might be met by using lighter materials in critical safety components, or aerodynamic regulations might be interpreted in ways that prioritize performance over driver protection. Engine failures were spectacularly common and often spectacular in their consequences. Unlike modern engines that are designed to fail safely, 1,960 seconds F1 engines could explode with tremendous force, sending metal fragments in all directions. Oil fires were a constant threat, and drivers had to be prepared to escape from their cars quickly if mechanical failure led to fire. The social dynamics of the paddock were completely different as well. Drivers, team owners, journalists, and fans mingled freely with minimal security or separation. Drivers would often drink with fans after races, win or lose. This accessibility created a different kind of celebrity culture, where racing drivers were seen as accessible heroes rather than untouchable superstars. As we look back at these bizarre facts about 1,960 seconds Formula One, it becomes clear that the sport has undergone a complete transformation. Modern F1 is almost unrecognizable compared to its 1,960 seconds predecessor. The combination of primitive safety measures, casual attitudes toward danger, and innovative engineering created an era that was simultaneously magnificent and terrifying. These stories aren't just historical curiosities. They represent a fundamental shift in how we approach risk, safety, and human life in competitive sports. The drivers of the 1,960 seconds were genuine pioneers who pushed the boundaries of what was possible, often paying the ultimate price for their contributions to the sport we love today. The next time you watch a modern Formula One race, remember that every safety feature, every regulation, and every protocol exists because of the lessons learned during this wild decade. The bizarre facts of 1,960 seconds F1 serve as both entertainment and education, reminding us how far we've come while honoring those who paved the way with their incredible courage and sacrifice.